Well, the clock has struck 1 here in Chicago. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the University of Chicago Graham School. And it is my great pleasure to be in conversation today with Katherine Buse, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Chicago Institute on the Formation of Knowledge and an incoming faculty member of the Cinema and Media Studies department here. And so we're very grateful to have a chance to talk with her and explore Frank Herbert's Dune and its many adaptations, including a sequel, Dune Messiah. And let me just tell you a little bit about Katherine before I turn it over and you get to actually hear from her, which is why I know you're all in our virtual room. Katherine uses methods from science and technology studies, science fiction studies, and the environmental humanities to study how science shapes and is shaped by its cultural milieu. She is working on a book project titled Speculative Planetology, Science, Culture, and the Building of Model Worlds, and she taught on that subject in the past at Graham to great acclaim. She also studies and designs video games, which will be very relevant to this conversation, including being on the design team for Folded First Contact, a new narrative version of the citizen science video game Folded. And we'll also hear how she informed some of the work in the film Dune Messiah. As a Marshall Scholar, which is something that I'm especially excited to share about her background because it's something that I also have in mind. She received an MA in Science Fiction Studies at the University of Liverpool and an MPhil in Criticism and Culture at Cambridge. And so with that, let me spotlight her. Let me take down the shared screen so we can see Katherine. And let me introduce our first question. So it's interesting, when I read your background and started with your interests in science fiction, environmental humanities, tell us a little bit about your research background and how you came into interest in Dune, this kind of popular science fiction area.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the questions. And thank you also for the introduction. So let's see. I think I've always really been interested in how our culture thinks about the future. Can you hear me okay? I want to make sure that okay, good. And so a lot of my research has centered around science fiction. And I even have, as you mentioned, this like very rare degree, a master's degree specifically in science fiction studies. But during that master's degree, which is all about studying science fiction, it's not about writing it, which is odd, but true. So during that degree, I didn't read Dune. I actually only read it in 2015, which is about 50 years after it was first published as a novel. And I didn't expect to like think much of it. But when I read it, I was just like stunned by like the ambition and scope of the world building in this thing. So this is the novel, and the last like 60 pages of the novel is appendices where Frank Herbert has added all of these like definitions of words that don't exist in the real world, and all of these I don't know, mini essays written from within the world about the world, like giving histories of different aspects of like the ecological theories in the novel or the religious theories or the different groups. So I was just like, this novel astounded me. And particularly because of this like really far future setting, which is not that common in contemporary science fiction, which tends to be a little bit like nearer future. This like really deeply thought through desert planet world that is deeply imbricated with the human world in these fascinating ways. And like things that I think are relevant today, like environmental crisis, extreme political division, a really big gap between the wealthy and the poor, things like that, that I felt like spoke to me in the now, but in a way that was also very, I don't know, it had a kind of vision of possibility that I didn't expect. So that's why I loved Dune. And I got so obsessed that my mentors started to warn me that like, if I only talked about Dune, I would be seen as Dune Girl and this could hurt my career. And then later on, as you mentioned, Seth, I got the chance to work with Eric Roth on the screenplay for the Denis Villeneuve version of Dune that came out in 2021. So, yeah.
Well, and you apparently are still willing to teach on Dune, even with the risk of becoming Dune Girl. So
I mean, I'm like leaning into Dune Girl at this point.
What does consulting on a film like that look like? Just on a quick sidebar, and then we'll jump into the meat.
Yeah, so Eric Roth, the screenwriter that I worked with, wanted to sort of freshen up the writing of the original novel, but keep its magic intact, I guess. Initially, we talked about what elements were most important and which things maybe needed like an update for 2021. So things like, how is gender handled in the novel? Like, do we really, some aspects of it could be seen as sexist in a way that was probably not intentional and would detract and distract from like the meanings. And so how do we fix that and sort of make the message more consonant with our 21st century setting? And then later on, we started talking about like what I guess the sort of science fictional logics of the world building almost scene by scene. So like in an early training scene for Paul that you all may have seen in the film, there's like fighting happening. And we had to think about like in this scene, we want people to learn something about the technology in this world, namely these shield technologies that make sword fighting all of a sudden necessary again, despite like being a really advanced futuristic world. We need to understand things about like the hierarchies and mentorships and things that our protagonist is dealing with. We need to understand like the way that self-defense is really important in this world. So you can have someone who's like an aristocrat, but isn't just relying on bodyguards. So we sort of thought about like what the granular moments in the novel did and which parts of them were essential for what showed up on screen, I guess. It was really fun.
Yeah, that sounds fun and amazing that you got to play that role in a film at that level of scale and eminence. Let's dive into the book. So in this course, you'll be reading the book, you'll be reading the sequel, you'll be looking at adaptations. If there's anyone here that has not read the book, tell us a little bit about Dune and then why Frank Herbert wrote it.
Totally. Okay, so I'd like to share my screen a little bit because there are some images that can help us think this through. Okay, so in 1957, Frank Herbert, who was like at that time a sort of modestly successful science fiction author, science fiction wasn't usually being published in novels at this time, it was being published in magazines, and Herbert had published a couple of things, and that's nice, but he was not like a well-known, not super well-known anyway. He was also a journalist, and he traveled to Florence, Oregon, and he was planning to write an article about this like United States Department of Agriculture project, to stabilize some sand dunes that were migrating across a highway. And he wanted to pitch this to the magazine California Living. It's hard to express without pictures, like the sheer massiveness of these Oregon dunes. And at this time, the concern about their like inexorable creep across human created landscapes. So you can see here in the top right of this image that like there's like some human settlements. This is an actual picture of dunes a bit south of Florence where Herbert was looking, not obviously from the time that Herbert was looking at them. And so Herbert became like really captivated by this. And these mid-century ecologists who he was writing about were basically working to apply their theories of ecology to this project by trying to convince the dunes to like become a forest. I don't mean emotionally, I mean like technically. So what they were trying to do was like plant little grasses and things, and like slowly you build up from like very small scale plantings that keep the sand locked down to larger and larger and more like self-sustaining networks of plants. So that's what they were working on. And you can tell that Herbert was inspired by this because he actually dedicates the novel to dryland ecologists. So he says, to the people whose labors go beyond ideas into the realm of real materials, to the dryland ecologists, wherever they may be, in whatever time they work, this effort at prediction is dedicated in humility and admiration. So I find this dedication fascinating because it sort of suggests both Herbert's like desire to think about the future in a predictive way. Like he's saying that we should imagine this desert planet as like a kind of reasonable future or imaginable future. And also that he's really fascinated by specifically these like weird ecologists who are trying to like stop dune progression across this one local place in Oregon. So Herbert basically imagines a world where the dunes had crept all the way over an entire planet. And thus we end up with Arrakis, which is this world with no water almost. People have to wear special suits to make sure their like sweat and exhaled liquids are collected. It also has these ferocious, gigantic sandworms. And it's the source of this really important, to the world of the novel, anti-aging drug called the spice melange, which is why people go there in the first place ever. Like it's so dangerous, you wouldn't otherwise want to be there, but everyone in the novel is living above 100 years because they can take this drug. And so this is the planet Dune, which is also called Arrakis. And the people who are native to this planet are like very secretive, and they're called the Fremen, and we don't learn about them until like later in the novel, but they'll be very, very important to the plot. Oops, I overshot. Okay, I think I can stop screen sharing. So the whole plot of Dune is only partly about ecology, though. It's also this space opera plot. So humanity is spread through the stars, and there are different people living on different planets. And it's sort of this decadent civilization where, you know, the very wealthy have lost touch with reality. And it has a lot of powerful players, an emperor, a secretive army of women who are like manipulating politics and psychology, mostly by getting themselves married to powerful people. And then a like guild of mathematical geniuses who control space travel and have never been seen by normal people. And so it's got a lot going on. And in it, there's this hero, Paul Atreides, who is like an aristocrat, and he and his family are sent to govern Arrakis, this desert planet, as part of a plot to destroy their house, basically to set them up to fail so that they get like destroyed. But it turns out Paul is super special, and through accidents of history, like he could not have landed in a better place than this planet, because he's going to hook up with the Fremen and end up changing the entire empire, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the plot. That's what it's about. And that's, I think, at least part of why Frank Herbert wrote it.
Well, that is awesome. And I think anyone who hasn't read it now is intrigued. In the course, you're going to go deep into the writing and you'll look at the book more deeply. But we're going to kind of fast forward, because the course looks at the book, looks at the sequel, and then begins to look at all these adaptations. And so we're going to come to those adaptations in a moment. And I already saw some of the slides we may see then. Tell us about why you think there is such an adaptation culture around Dune. In other words, like, why did this book get such a following? Why have so many people built so many adaptations? You know, you just described it. Why do you think that has had such a pull on our culture over such a long time span, right? This is a 60s book originally, and we're still talking about it. It's 2023. You know, tell us the why, and then we'll jump into the what.
Yeah, so it has a lot of adaptations, that's right. And it also has not even just one sequel, but many sequels. So if you count the books by Brian Herbert, which is Frank Herbert's son, who I tend not to count these, but if you did, then it would be a 25 book series.
Wow.
I think. Don't quote me on that, but about 25 anyway. And so about the relevance, like why people continue to keep coming back to this story over and over. I'd actually argue that it's a completely different book today than it was in 1958 when Herbert was learning about these sand dunes in Oregon, or than it was in 1965 when it was published as a novel for the first time. Like an equally good book, but definitely, perhaps counterintuitively, a completely different one. It was actually hard for Herbert to publish Dune as a novel. It was turned down by a bunch of different presses, and it was eventually published by Chilton, which was better known for its automotive manuals than for publishing novels. So at the time, maybe people didn't really see the relevance, you know, the particular relevance of this like far out story of a weird desert planet. And there are a few reasons for that I will touch on briefly. So for example, in this period, in the like early 60s, environmentalism is barely a thing at all. That's why he dedicates it, or the novel, in my opinion, to dryland ecologists, right? Ecology at the time is a science, the same way like psychology is, but there wasn't necessarily like a political movement attached to that in the same way that we would think of today. It was later picked up by environmentalists as like a really important environmentalist text, but it couldn't have been written with that in mind because that wasn't really a thing yet. Similarly, like the Anthropocene, right? The idea of like a planet-wide ecological change, which is so relevant to us today, that was barely a conversation at all, like really not common way of thinking for ecologists or for like growing environmentalists until the 80s and 90s, really more the 90s than the 80s. So Herbert's doing this planetary upscaling for his own reasons that have nothing to do with like trying to help us understand climate change. Nonetheless, it does become a place where people can think about it later on. Another couple of examples are like the counterculture, right? Drugs like the spice melange, these like mind-altering, groovy substances. The idea of wanting to have other worlds in a way that's sort of political and countercultural at the same time. All of this was barely a thing when Herbert was publishing the novel. It got picked up by them later. And other things come up later, like spice not being able to be not being able to be made, but having to be mined, and the analogy with oil. That became super relevant in the 70s. But at the time, it was a reasonable analogy, but it wasn't like as significant as it would become. And then all this weird stuff about psychology and AI. Like in the world of his book, Herbert imagines that there's been this war called the Butlerian Jihad that was basically the decision to say that you can't make computers or intelligent machines. And so thus the people in the novel are have these incredible mental powers that they've developed over, thousands of years of history of not being able to use computers. So basically they have human computers. And in the mid 20th century, there was this obsession with the idea that psychology would have this amazing breakthrough and people would be able to control objects with their mind or see the future. And there were actually some scientific experiments on this, J.B. Rhine at Duke University was really interested in seeing if people could predict the future, or I don't know, you be psychic, essentially. So in other words, one thing in Dune that seems very unscientific to us now was actually at the time seen as more plausible than other things, maybe. So one answer I guess I'd say is it's a totally different novel now. And there's something weird about it that has allowed it to kind of be this enduring text we return to, despite the fact that you can't really interpret it the same way now as you did then. The other possible answer has to do with the hero's journey. And I have mixed feelings about this, but it's definitely something we'll talk about in the class. So Herbert intentionally modeled his novel on The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. And the mapping is so precise that you can literally give students an exam question where it's tell me each beat in The Hero's Journey and which part of the novel corresponds to it. And you'll get roughly the same answers. And it's sort of The Hero's Journey, for those who don't know about it, is this coming of age kind of story form that's mythic and sort of eternal, at least in Campbell's vision of it. And it's about this hero who sets out and receives training, gets tested by situations, gets help from certain people, overcomes crises, and returns with wisdom and rewards to make a different world or whatever. And yeah, Herbert mirrored this completely on purpose. And so you could say that Dune is timeless because it's built on these this timeless framework. But as we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about Dune Messiah, he actually intended this to be a timeless framework with a little bit of a twist.
Well, there have been so many adaptations for the reasons that you just named so brilliantly. And so can we dive into those? And I know you were sharing some slides before, and just look at all the different adaptations. Mm-hmm. And then I'm curious to ask the question of, you mentioned this is a different book today. It's equally relevant, but in a new way. I'm curious, if after you share these adaptations, you can just reflect a bit about what do the adaptations say about the book itself and its relevance and insight. So let's start though with the adaptations and the movies, one of which on here, it sounds like you consulted to. I'm guessing that's the 2021 version.
Yeah. So, okay. So we'll be covering a number of different adaptations of the novel. And they're a chance for us to talk about basically two big buckets of things. One is how have we changed Dune as a culture as we keep it relevant to our changing history? And the other is, so in other words, which things were seen as important to adapt and which things were seen as not important, similar to, my conversation with Eric Roth about do we want the Bene Gesserit to be as much gendered in this way where it's about women being reproductive and men being scientific, or do we want to slightly shift that kind of thing? So in other words, how do we see Dune evolving over time? But also, what can we learn about media from seeing how a story has to change when it gets transformed like that? So let me walk through some of the different adaptations we'll cover, and then I'll sort of return to that second question. So there are 3 film adaptations that we'll look at. One is this film that was never made. That's the center one here. It's a documentary telling the story of the Chilean filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky's quest to create a Dune film in the 1970s. He had this insane, incredibly striking vision Amazing creative ideas. He was planning on, it was going to be like a ridiculously long film. Like I can't exactly remember how many hours it was going to be, but many more than is reasonable for a single film. And he had like Salvador Dali playing the emperor and all of these amazing illustrations and creative ideas. And basically it was just like so big that it had to fail, is I think the argument of this documentary made in 2013 about this project. But it ended up having like an enormous effect on Hollywood and on like the history of science fiction, because his like dossier of ideas was out there, and it ended up influencing like everyone else who was, you know, like Star Wars and all of these later imaginings of different science fiction images, just because of the sort of scope and incredible creativity of this idea. So first we'll talk about, or I don't know, not first, I guess, but that's one of the ones we'll talk about. We'll also be talking about David Lynch's Dune, which has been joked about a lot. And I think it's intriguing to think about like what it got wrong and right and why, and what kinds of choices were made. It can tell us a lot about the history of the 1980s, as well as being able to tell us something about like the form of this novel and why it's so difficult to adapt. And maybe it can just tell us things about, I don't know, science fiction culture in the time and things like that. And then we'll talk about the 2021 film as well. This one's important to me in terms of medium and adaptation, like what has to happen to a novel to make it into this new form. It's not just the screenwriters and the director. I realized when I was working on, or when I was sort of consulting with the screenplay, and then when I saw the film, like there are actors, special effects people, so many other people who get involved in creating this vision. And I think that creates a really different thing than something written by just one author. But it also makes the rhetoric different to have a visual medium rather than a written medium. So like instead of using language to give clues about the history of the world, we're using images to do the same thing. So here's like a few little images from that film, which I think like they convey a lot, but they don't explain it. They don't explain what these technologies are, what these like, yeah, instead you have to use context and like visual rhetoric, I guess, to understand the same things. So that to me is very intriguing and is something that I expect us to talk about. I'm then interested in the TV miniseries, which we can connect back to the first week when we'll be talking about magazines. I haven't mentioned this yet, but Dune was actually first serialized as part of Analog magazine, a science fiction magazine, before it came out as a novel. And so the serial format, you could almost argue, is like built into the text. And perhaps that gives us an interesting way into the sci-fi miniseries from 2000, which some people say is the best Dune adaptation, although I actually haven't seen it, so we'll find out. And perhaps it's because of the serial format that it was so successful. And then I think the question of adaptation is really fascinating with the video games. So both of these video game adaptations of Dune came out in the same year. And one is this like really beautiful narrative adventure story where you fly around this planet and you like listen to this really great music and you learn about Fremen communities, and it's all about like interpersonal conversations. You can't really get anything done without talking to a person. And it's all about characters. And then the other is this crazy management strategy game where you're just mining spice and competing with all these other imperial houses and you don't really talk to anyone. And so I'm fascinated by both that, like both of these stories exist in the novel, but somehow these two games in the same year produced these incredibly divergent visions of like what the novel is about. And also I'm fascinated by what that can tell us about like computational media and video game form. So like why is it that in order to create something that's interactive, you have to like create these like looping processes that mean that you can only tell certain stories and not other ones? So that's an exciting conversation. And I do want to disclaim that I'll make playing the games optional, but it is possible in your browser, and I'll give you a little bit of a hint to how to do it, or, you know, I'll help you if you want. But I understand not everyone wants to play a video game. And so we'll try to do a little bit of viewing as an alternative. So if you want to just watch someone play, that's also possible. Okay, so those I think are all of the adaptations. I've lost my mouse, and so I can't seem to, where is it? Oh no.
There we go. We see you again.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all the adaptations, and we'll be working with a different one each week. I hope I haven't already said this, but I've set the course up to avoid most spoilers. So we'll be talking about the magazine serialization first, because that doesn't require us to talk about any of the plot. And then we'll be looking at the video games, which we'll only be able to play through the very beginning of, so we won't have spoilers there. And by the time that we get to the films, which are trying to cover most of the novel, we'll have almost finished. So hopefully the order may be not as chronological as is ideal, but it will be ideal for anyone who hasn't actually read Dune to sort of not be experiencing spoilers from these adaptations. But we're kind of we'll be watching the adaptations along with reading the text.
Well, I have one final question, then we're going to come to the audience. And I already see some questions. I'll invite more. I'll also just acknowledge you are a brilliant audience, no surprise, at the University of Chicago. And that when you occasionally, which is rare in this conversation, said, I'm not sure how many hours that is, immediately one of our audience members is 12 hours. And
perfect.
so there is a lot of knowledge in this shared room. Tell us a little bit about how you're going to approach teaching this course in terms of, there are 2 books that you're diving into, in addition to obviously the 20 plus that have been written in the series, the example that you gave of the magazine. We've got TV, we've got movies, we've got games. Even though it's one theme, it's got so many adaptations, that's a lot to cover. How will you approach it as an instructor?
Okay, so yeah, there are a lot of themes and issues to talk about in Dune, the novel, that is, and I've touched on a lot of them already. So things like, what did people at the time that Dune was written think about the world and their future, history of science kind of questions as well. The context of publication, which will bring us into the history of science fiction, the golden age and the new wave, right? This kind of strange transformation within the field of science fiction about what it means to think about speculation and futures and sort of reality differently. They'll also be talking a lot about the way that Dune is newly relevant now and how we can use moments from the text to think sort of, philosophically and theoretically about our own world and how it works and what's possible in it. So things like the spice and the risk to the people who mine it and how that risk is considered reasonable by the people who are sort of in control of the planet, but is it really reasonable? That kind of thing. And then we'll be talking about Dune Messiah. And I really think that Dune Messiah is important because the reason it's important is because it's the first of several sequels that Herbert would write to Dune. And Joseph Campbell, the editor who serialized the original Dune novel, refused to publish it. He was angry about it. And actually, a lot of readers were also upset about it because it kind of messes up this beautiful hero journey arc that the original novel had. And it does that completely on purpose. Herbert wants us to realize that having a hero can actually be a disaster, and that having anyone with that much power can actually be a disaster, even if that person is well-intentioned and a great person and, very competent. And so in a sense, it would be better if we could read all 5, but because we can't, we're at least going to read enough that we understand what Herbert is getting at when he tries to mess up the hero's journey at the end and kind of invert it and, tear it apart. So that's why I think it's important to include that text. As to how I'll structure class time, a small amount of class time might involve me giving context that can help us understand what's going on in the texts. So things like, what was happening in the history of psychology at this time that allowed us to imagine the Bene Gesserit using the voice, to influence people, things like that. But most of class time, I hope, will be spent unpacking the readings, which is just basically these novels. I want a lively participatory discussion about the novel, and we're moving through it relatively slowly. I inhaled the novel Dune the first time I read it in about 4 days, and we're going to be taking 8 weeks with it, or not quite, 6 weeks with it. So we'll be really having a lot of time for discussion. And I'll have ideas about what to talk about, but I'll be also looking for my students to bring their own ideas. And we'll try to keep the conversation grounded in the text, but also in what it lets us understand about the wider world. And then the last part of each class meeting will be a chance to talk about these viewings and sort of adaptations and how they expand or shift our picture of the novel or the world. So I think that's how I'll set up individual class meetings.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I want to move us into questions from prospective students here. Alexis Varvel says, how relevant is Leto II's personal transformation to modern politics?
That's an interesting question that I think you could answer on a couple of different levels. So I think I'm just going to live in a world where it's okay to use spoilers to help people understand what this question means. So Leto II is Paul, the main character of Dune's child. And essentially the sort of messing up of the hero's journey that I referred to earlier basically means that things get really out of whack politically, ecologically, economically, socially in this culture. And in fact, they get so out of whack that Leto II, the son of Paul, needs to find a way to live for 1,000 years, I think, but it could be, I'm kind of bad at remembering numbers. So anyway, a really long time, so that he can basically have this like authoritarian regime that like gets the people in the novel back on track, so to speak. And so that's the personal transformation, I think, that Alexis is referring to, but please let me know if that's not what you mean. 3,500 years, sorry. So is it relevant to contemporary politics? I think you could read it as relevant to contemporary politics in two ways. One way being that there's a lot of people in like our world who use the idea of a god emperor, which is what Leto II becomes, to make certain points about the world. So this is a really complicated topic that I was wondering whether we would spend time on in class or not. And then I decided maybe I would see whether the students wanted to talk about it before we did. But this god emperor concept has been sort of politically weaponized, I'd say, in the last decade or so. And we could definitely spend some time talking about like what its relevance is seen to be, why people are interested in the idea of someone who's like so all powerful and so eternal, that kind of thing. Like which parts of it are significant to people today when they want to talk about a god emperor. So we could talk about it in terms of how it's used now, or we could talk about it in terms of like, what does it mean to imagine that someone should have the kind of power to get things back into whack by reigning for 3,500 years? Do we actually believe that that's a good idea? Do we think does Herbert want us to think? And do we think that that's like laudable, so to speak? So I think those are the two ways that we could talk about it.
Well, it certainly makes our term limits in America look very short by comparison. Sean Carroll asked, do you believe there are any indications in the original Dune of Frank Herbert's intention to invert, destroy the archetype in Messiah? So are we given any clues that sequel approach is coming?
Yeah, totally. I think we are given a very large number of clues. So I think we are both sort of, both in the sense of like our own sense of aesthetics and morality. So we'll hear things about like our supposed Messiah who's like going to solve everything, doing really brutal things. And are we supposed to think that that's good? Or are we supposed to be like, that doesn't sound that great? So I think we're meant to question whether this is a good thing or not, that he's rising to power. And I also think that we can see it in our hero's own like reluctance or concerns. Like he basically says that the ending of the novel, like the character says that the ending of the novel that we end up with is like a horrific thing that he's trying to avoid for like at least the first half of the novel. So yes, I think the clues are there that we're supposed to see this as very questionable.
Right. We have another question here. Do I recall correctly that the Jordarsky Dune documentary stated that he hadn't even read the novel? And maybe we see here that he hadn't when he accepted the job and then did. Mm-hmm. But talk a little bit about him and the journey he was on as a director, and maybe a little bit more detail about why this journey in the 70s failed.
Right. Okay. So why this journey? Yes. The reason it failed, sorry, I got a little bit distracted by the excellent Q&A conversation and was like so excited. So the reason it failed, I think, is because it was just too ambitious, too big, seemed too high risk. And perhaps even was like somewhat quixotic in its essential nature. We can talk about that when we see the documentary and decide whether we agree or not. But, like Jodorowsky had his own son who was going to play Paul, and he had this idea of like turning his whole parenting strategy into like this kind of weird messianic conversion thing that was going to like turn his son into Paul in some ways. which is wild. And he, had all of these stakeholders and all of these like art ideas, but it was just so gigantic. And I think someone here, is it Sean Carroll again? Someone wrote that, there weren't really like very big budget science fiction films at this point. That kind of came later. So I think it was just like too much.
Joe Renwald asks, with respect to transhumanism and the mutability of the human experience in the source material, does Herbert seem to take a stance on the moral or ethical nature of such changes? So how does it look at that kind of question of, I think this is, the possibility that there's essentially AI-based human, or you may read it differently, the subject matter better, but I read it as, this idea that you mentioned earlier in the book that, we almost turn computers into humans.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a moral or ethical view on that in the book, in your mind?
Yeah, so I think that this question about transhumanism is definitely partly about the possible computational taking over of things. I think it's also about like the question of like, so for example, the guild navigators, right? What I call the guild of mathematician geniuses, like they've changed themselves so much in this novel that they like can't live on land. They can only really be in space. They've like really transformed their being. And we have a lot of these like strange transformations in the novel, like all of the mentats, who are basically these like political advisors who act as human computers for their various liege lord type people. They all are on drugs, different drugs, and like they're physically altered by these drugs. So like their like mouths are stained or their eyes are changed. And so there is this sense of like human alteration. I think that, wait, I'm trying to remember whether the question was, what does the novel think about that? Or
yeah, if there's like an ethical view on that.
Yes. It's an interesting question. I think on one level, Herbert does have an ethical view on that. Like, I think he sort of thinks that if we rely on machines, then the human becomes weaker. I think he does actually believe that, or it seems to me that he believes that. So that it's important for us to like develop our human capacities. However, in developing them, we basically become not human anymore. So I think it's kind of this two-edged sword, because I think you could easily argue that like Paul and his mother and many of the characters in this text are like no longer truly human from our own perspective of what it means to be human.
Julia Riley says, you mentioned at the top the incredible world building. How would you draw lines between the world building in Tolkien's fantasy from the work done by Herbert, particularly with the deep religious angle? Is this, in fact, closer to fantasy than science fiction?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. And it's one that I'm inclined to answer in a couple of different ways. So I think on the one hand, the answer should just be yes. There are ways in which this is like a kind of hybrid of fantasy and science fiction. It's also not uncommon in this moment for texts to do that, right? For science fiction not to be like, the whole idea of hard science fiction is sort of emerging at the same moment in history, but like before that, the idea of hard science fiction wasn't really there. And so the ways in which the science part of science fiction got interpreted were more varied, and to appeal to science fiction audiences, some like fantasy elements were often considered desirable, I suppose. That's not a very good description, but it is true. So on the other hand, there are ways in which Herbert kind of turns fantasy into science fiction. So like I gave the example of the shields and how they can't interact with a laser gun. And so even though laser guns exist in the world, you can't use them. And so everyone's sword fighting. In other words, like it feels neo-medieval, but it's actually like neo-medieval for a reason. Or there's some kind of like motivation, or like the sandworms, which are explained like ecologically and chemically and biologically to a certain extent, but they're also kind of dragons. So like, it's kind of like a rationalized fantasy, if that makes sense. but yeah, it is, I think, very intentionally drawing on fantasy as one of its like major influences.
Well, so there's a quote here from Gil Matar. Do any of you think the Dune movies, especially the first one, were boundly hurt by their emphasis on special effects instead of story? A prime example, in the first movie, I think the transit from Caledon to Arrakis took maybe 15 to 20 minutes of screen time, but not even a page in the novel. And was curious for your comments. Wasn't that typical of the time? The 1979 Star Trek movie had very little dialogue. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how that, adaptation from book to film, your reactions to it, and in particular, maybe, this kind of commitment to special effects over text?
Yeah, that's something that I have. Well, I have my own feelings about that, and I also think it's like an important issue. So, like, it does seem as if that happens every time there's like a screen adaptation of Dune, right? That there's this, that the novel is so like visually rich sound seeming that there's this like need to like put all of those pieces in. And maybe particularly in the like David Lynch version, the like fascination with spaceships is too much or something like that. But I also think like it's interesting to think about things like technologies that are so easily described in the novel, but then like get so much sort of visual attention on the screen, right? Like the suspensors that hold up the Baron, right? He's this like large sized man who's like light on his feet because he's held up by these weightless objects. And like that's easy to write in the novel and to have only be relevant in the novel when it gets mentioned. So like sometimes they'll talk about the suspensors and sometimes you may not be thinking about them when you're reading about the Baron, but on screen, the suspensors are a constant concern, right? They're either there or they're not, and you have to decide how to handle them. Let me think. I guess for myself, I kind of agree. Like I'm a really invested in the textuality of Dune. And I do think that like removing a lot of words as one must to adapt it for screen does to me lose some of the texture, particularly the fact that Dune is so psychological and so like interior focused. So you have these people who are like thinking a lot and doing a lot of like mental strategizing and like strategy theory thinking about like, oh, this person means this and that must mean that they actually are aligned with these people, and all this scheming and plotting. And I think that's almost impossible to represent on screen. So you kind of have to emphasize different aspects of the text when you're adapting it for film.
So we have time for one more question. And this is from a student who says, any thoughts on the end of the book where they're talking about concubine versus wife? They acknowledge they always thought that was an odd ending. It certainly sounds like one in that phrasing. Yeah, what's your reaction to that ending? And I'm curious if maybe you gave any advice there on the movie, given that, I imagine some of that probably was an opportunity for updating.
So I actually didn't have the chance to give advice on that part because the Villeneuve film is only the first half of, or first part of what's going to be multiple films. So I gave no advice about that, but I did give related advice about like the Lady Jessica and how I thought that she should be portrayed and why I thought that she should have like a relatively large role in the film. I'd say the concubines versus wives thing is very strange because it's so oddly ironical. Like the whole novel is structured with these like opening little quotations, such as this one, that are supposed to be like quotations from like texts that are like historical texts analyzing the world of the novel from like a retrospective but futuristic perspective. Does that make sense? So it's like books that are written about Paul's life after it's over. And in it, many of them are written by the Princess Irulan, who turns out to be Paul's actual wife. And so like we know that history is not really attending to these women who are like concubines as much as it should, because they're like super central to the plot. And so I don't know if we're supposed to read that as ironic, but I think we must be expected to read it as ironic. Like we must be expected to read it as kind of messed up that like the Lady Jessica and Chani are so important, but they're so undervalued by like these later historical narratives.
Well, we have no time left, but I'll just ask, in like the 30-second version, Catherine, how has being a Dune girl changed your life? Like, how has it shaped the way you look at the world more broadly?
It's almost hard to differentiate that, but I'd say that being a Dune girl has been important because it has helped me understand how someone starts with certain materials, like a fascination with mid-century working ecology, and ends up with this like incredible apparatus of planetary world building that has become, you know, much bigger than what it even started out as, this kind of like rolling snowball downhill of meanings. And it's given me this theory of like what media can do for us and how it can change how we understand the world, and how that relates to story and image and representation in different ways.
Well, great writers help us to build new worlds and universes, and so do great educators. And over the last 45 minutes, you've been able to kind of build the universe in which we can better understand the novel, its implications, and its role in society. Thank you, and really excited for your course this spring. And thank you to the many people in this audience who were co-contributors to this conversation. One of the things I love about chat is that it's two events in one, and the comments are amazing, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but many of them were answered by your peers alongside Katherine. So thank you all. Excited for this to come alive for 8 weeks this spring, and have great afternoons, everyone.
Me too. Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited for this class. You all know so much and have so much to say.
Bye.